And I just want to welcome all of you to the kickoff virtual panel to the Oklahoma Council for History Education's weekend conference. This panel is intended to really bring some great insight for educators to enrich their curriculums and enrich themselves with the information and the insight that you all bring. Amanda Moore is a social studies teacher at Riverside Indian School, and she is a board member on the Oklahoma Council for History Education. She's going to go ahead and introduce all of you and talk a little bit about what she hopes each of you bring to this conversation. Go ahead, Amanda. Amanda, go ahead and unmute and feel free to introduce each of our panelists whenever you're ready.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Moore. So first of all, I wanted to explain what the purpose of this panel discussion is. First of all, we really wanted to focus on why it's important to teach and learn history, particularly Indigenous history, objectively and accurately. And then second, in choosing these panelists, I wanted the panel to be well-versed across all educational institutions and backgrounds. We have early childhood, secondary, and post-secondary all represented. Also, I wanted there to be a wide range of tribal representation as well. We have representation from the Cheyenne Arapaho tribe, the Comanche Nation, the Citizen Band of Potawatomi, and the Kiowa tribe. The panelists all have deep roots and experience in education, such as developing curriculum, collaborating with surrounding schools and universities, instruction experience, and creating resources for learning and college and career readiness for Indigenous students, as well as serving as liaisons for surrounding tribal nations. So, and then last, we just wanted to thank both News 9 and OKCHE for providing us with this platform and time to be able to share our insight and resources with educators and history enthusiasts across the state. So I will go ahead and jump into the introduction. So first we have Ms. Carrie Whitlow. She is the Director of Education for the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. Next we have Carolyn Cotaponi. She is the Director of Early Childhood for the Comanche Nation. Next we have Dr. Toni Satok Mule. She works with the Department of Native American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Next, we have Tasia Zintek. She is the Director of Education for the Citizen Band of Potawatomi. And then last, we have Allison Black. She is the Indian Education Coordinator for Stillwater Public Schools, as well as the President for Oklahoma Council of Indian Education.
All right, thank you, Amanda, and thank you all for taking the time to share. Let's get into it. So first question, a little bit about method. Discuss the importance of the relationship between curriculum and pedagogy, and how should an Indigenous education be taught?
I'll jump right in. And so I was thinking about this question about how Indigenous education should be taught, and I'm coming from an early childhood perspective, but I believe that it should value the children's home language and culture and incorporating appropriate elements into the classroom that ultimately value Indigenous children and their worldviews.
I'll go ahead and add something to that. Another thing that educators can take into consideration is learning from the surrounding tribes around you, whether that's locally or statewide, just simply doing any kind of small research, just, jumping on Google and looking up what tribal nations are around you, maybe learning about some of the history that they have provided, for example, on their website. That would just be, one small thing that educators could take the time out to do. And also looking at smaller details, just to sort of piggyback off of what I mentioned, learning how to properly pronounce Indigenous names in history, such as chief names, tribal nations, locations of places that are named after or in honor of Indigenous people. Those are just, some of the smaller details that they might not seem like much to some people, but when you're sitting in a history class and you're hearing these Indigenous places and people, you're hearing their names being pronounced correctly, it sort of gives you a sense of pride, and you're like, wow, my teacher really is taking the time and consideration to learn how to pronounce those.
I'll go ahead and jump in, and I was going to say that I feel like a lot of times when Native topics are taught, we're kind of boxed into a historical perspective. And I feel like you would be hard pressed not to find Native contributions in all subject matter. And so looking for opportunities for that inclusion on the curriculum side.
I'll go ahead and answer. This is Carrie. So from my perspective, I'm a TED director and I oversee relationships, with the public schools in our service area. So I've never worked in a public school. I've never taught. So whenever we say, here, teach our history, teach you to know these things, that they're often asking for curriculum and resources. However, within our department right now, we don't have people who know how to write curriculum. We don't have people who are familiar with pedagogy and what that means. We know what it means, but in the Western sense, we can't, that's just a different word, and we're not always connected to that. So what we've done, and I was explaining this to Augusta the other day, that it sounds great that let's do language and culture curriculum. And I'll tell you, because this is my experience, let's do language and culture curriculum for, schools in our service area. Okay, that's a great idea. However, in the process of doing this, of writing down curriculum, we're also asking people who are, Cheyenne Arapaho people are still very traditional people. They don't want, some things written down. They don't want this knowledge taken from them and then given it to, non-native people. So there's apprehension, and I've experienced that within this last year. We think this seems easy and it seems great. However, there's a whole process to it, and whose knowledge that we're using and utilizing. And sometimes it's not always, to them to say, oh, well, let's just give that knowledge away, and coming with asking those things of these people, that I know that you have to be respectful and tell them why we want this information, who we're utilizing it for. So they understand that. But then also, I think that we also get generalized that it's always Indigenous and Native American, American Indian, but find out whose land that you're occupying, be specific to that tribe, of whose area that you're in, find out, call. All you got to do is call sometimes. And that's how we always, we have a number of people within our department that are singers, storytellers. We have just so many people that dance and do a number of things. So anytime that we're asked, we'll go and present information. So that's also reflective, I think, of our pedagogy, of saying that this is a way that we think, and this is how we want our information, that we'll tell you about it, but we're not going to write it down and put it on a piece of paper and hand it out for everyone to know. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how we've been. Anytime we're invited, we present that information. You're here, you're going to learn because I'm going to show you, not necessarily that we're going to learn it from a book. So we're still in that process from the tribal nation of writing things down and saying this is our perspective, but also who's telling that and who is it for. So you have to be very clear about those things too. So I just wanted to share that.
And to piggyback off a little bit of what Dr. Tony Satok had mentioned before about teaching in a historical sense, Illuminative did a study, many studies that show that if you Google Native Americans, you'll see stuff pre-1900. So it's really important to keep that in consideration because we are learning history, but we still exist today. So one of the things that can help aid that is to look at your pedagogy. And so I work in a public school, so I get approached by teachers all the time. How do I do this? I don't want to get it wrong. I want to say the right thing. I want to teach the right thing. I don't want to be offensive. But to narrow it down to your pedagogy and look at how you're actually presenting your topics, there's data out there and research that show that chronological ordering of your topics doesn't incite critical thinking in your students if you take a more of an analogetic approach where you're taking a current issue and comparing it to the past or past issue and comparing it to a contemporary issue. That does incite critical thinking, and so you cause students to critically think about Native Americans, and connecting it with a contemporary issue definitely keeps us in the present instead of in the past as well. And so, and also another big thing that I stress big time for my teachers, specifically if they, I completely agree with that, and that's what I share with my teachers is, use your tribes that are around here. So I'm around the Oto-Missouri tribe, the Potawatomi Nation, the Iowa tribe. So I encourage them, if you're going to do an art lesson, look at their art. Don't just go with, the stereotypical totem pole or something like that, but look at the Otos. They use floral designs, but look at your sources. If you can't specifically get tribal assistance or help for reasons like what Carrie had mentioned, look at the basis of your the book that you're using. Make sure it's an Indigenous author on an Indigenous subject. So those are some of the things that I tell my teachers when I work with them.
These ladies have said such wonderful things, so I don't have a whole lot to add except for just echoing, whenever possible, to contact the local tribe or tribes in your area. For the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, we are undergoing an effort to write our own tribal standards in an effort to answer the question, how can we at the Citizen Potawatomi Nation teach the curriculum that we teach in early childhood, the lesson plans we're developing? We want to make sure that we are following our own tribal values, but that is something we would be willing to share with other schools. And so we have started to draft those based on a teaching that we have called the Noak Mashomasak, the Seven Grandfathers, which are wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. So these are pretty basic values, but we have lined out exactly how an educator can make sure that they are teaching in such a way and that their curriculum is aligning with these values. So other tribes have similar things. I think the main takeaway here is just use your resources and connect with the tribes in your area, and they more than likely have a lot to say about how you can approach the subject matter.
Can I add one more thing too? Because I know we talked a lot about curriculum, but on the pedagogical side, I feel like we talk a lot about, think a lot about multiple intelligences. And in terms of cultural intelligence, or what some people might say cultural capacity, is that sometimes I feel like Native students they're approached with a kind of one size fits all. Like the teachers have expectations that aren't necessarily assessed or graded, but that they expect children to behave a certain way. So social norms are really important to know a little bit about. And I don't want to overgeneralize, but like going back to some of the values that were just mentioned, like humility and respect, the way that traditionally that Native people learn is really through apprenticeship. And so they're used to learning in modes. Again, I don't want to overgeneralize, but they don't want to do the try it. What is it? You try something and don't be afraid to make mistakes in front of people, like just give it a shot. That type of approach is very difficult for some Native students because they're used to sitting back, watching somebody model a behavior or a skill, and they don't demonstrate that until they've mastered it. And so it's something to ask someone just to try it and get up in front of their classroom and try something that they're not comfortable with, or they haven't fully mastered, can be very difficult. And sometimes I feel like we as educators expect Native children to behave like everybody else. And the fact is that culturally they're different. And we need to recognize that instead of trying to make everybody behave the same way, or fight for attention or stand out. That's just not something that we value in our culture. So I just wanted to say that.
Okay, so I feel like I heard kind of two key takeaways for educators. One, seeking resources for working with Native students in any classroom is critical to enriching that student's education, meeting them where they're at with culturally sensitive considerations. And then also, when it works well, working with local tribes to enrich Indigenous curriculums, and that there's a lot of detailed, specific, respectful resources there for any classroom. Wonderful answers.
Yes, I have a suggestion too, that when contacting the tribe, don't try to contact the governor in his office or the chairman. Seek out the tribe's tribal education department, tribal education agency. Utilize those people, because sometimes when you try to reach the governor, he or she has so many duties that those requests sometimes get overlooked. However, every tribe should have like a higher education office, a TED or TEA, but contact those people and they can direct you in the right way.
And to piggyback a little bit off of Carrie, if you're a teacher within a district and you have a Title VI or a JOM program, they would be a good resource to go through them so they can make the connection. Because I don't mean to generalize either, but they probably more than likely have a contact into that tribe or a good working relationship. So there's another place, if you're not feeling comfortable yourself going straight to the tribe. So.
Great, thank you. Let's move to the next question. And a couple of you sort of touched on this in your previous answer as well, but let's discuss the significance of teaching history and drawing connections to contemporary life. So a couple of you already sort of went over, Indigenous people don't just live in the past, in the 19th century. There's active communities in our contemporary life as well. So let's kind of go over what does it look like to draw those connections in a classroom?
One thing that our tribal vice chair, Linda Capps, often says when she speaks to students, and she's a former educator, so she loves to talk to students. And one thing she always hits on is that the Citizen Potawatomi Nation is the largest employer in our county. And that is the case for a lot of different tribes. So she brings that up to say that the students in the classroom, whether they are Native or not, whether they're Potawatomi or not, are likely going to end up working for a tribe. And if they stay in our area, probably the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And that the students are usually surprised by that, even though that ends up being the truth. So part of the reason, beyond what the other panelists have already said, that it's so important is that a lot of these young students will end up interacting with Indigenous people and possibly working for a tribe. They need to understand and be culturally competent so that their future is brighter and a little bit easier for them, and that they can be respectful in whatever role they have. So tribes are incredible neighbors. They are partners in every community that they're located in. And so students, if they are learning about tribes as current, modern, innovative nations now, that's going to help them be good partners and neighbors to the tribes in their area whenever they enter the workforce and leave school.
I think it's interesting that you, you mentioned just the very, tangible intertwine of tribal nations and the state of Oklahoma. I mean, there's incredible, economic and social power within the tribes in Oklahoma. And I mean, can you give an example, Tasia, of, despite just working for the tribe, but maybe a way that this could work well in a lesson for other educators in other areas of the state?
We recently did a focus group with Norman Public Schools on a lesson plan that we were working on. And when we were speaking with their Indian education director, Lucianne Harjo, Lucianne mentions, we asked her for ideas because we want this to be a partnership with the schools that we work with. So we asked, well, what do your educators and what are your students curious to learn about Native nations so that we can, tailor the lesson plans and curricula we're working on to fit the need. And she said one idea was she gets a lot of questions about the signs that say you are entering the citizen Potawatomi Nation or you are leaving the Seminole Nation. That really struck us because we thought, well, that is something we see every day. You can tie that to the idea of jurisdiction. You can tie that to land loss related to the land runs. You can tie that to the idea of trust and what that means in legal terms. I mean, just that simple idea of understanding what those signs mean can touch on both, historically why tribes are here, but also what it means for them to be here now. So I think that's a really tangible example of using what the students are seeing every day and maybe what we even take for granted as adults of what those signs and symbols mean. That really struck me when Lucianne brought that up.
I can add an example. So currently I'm teaching a course, Native American Women, and I'll admit that even my own teaching style has changed, and I'm always in a mode of improvement. And so looking at how I taught the class in previous years is not how I would teach it today. But I think even in my, my language classes, which I try to incorporate culture into that as well, it's important for them, students, to identify contemporary people. So if you're teaching an art class, identify a contemporary artist, a Native artist. So somebody talked about teaching in chronological order, and I think I deliberately try to do the opposite so that they can know that there's people around you, there's people on your campus, there's people in your community, no matter what topic that you're teaching, you can identify somebody, a Native person that's working in that discipline or that field. So, identify real people. If you can bring people into your classroom and make it authentic in that way. But even if you can't and don't have the resources to do that, I think it's key to whatever subject matter that you're teaching is to identify contemporary people, Native women that are working in government or lawyers or doctors or whatever the subject matter is, but bringing in real people that they can see, oh, these people actually live, amongst us in our community. And I think that's really important to incorporate.
I want to kind of give an example of what we did this summer with, we partnered with the Caddo Nation, the Kiowa tribe, and the Apache tribe of Oklahoma down here in Southwest Oklahoma, where I'm at. And we wanted to have a summer learning camp so that we could get our students back in a really great frame of mind when they went back to school because of the pandemic. And so we used some of our supplemental money, and we brought in we're early childhood, but we were used to dealing with really small, the young child, but we also provide services for children that till they turned 13. And so we wanted our school age children to have a good experience, learning experience before they went back to school. And so we brought in the community, and that's key because in their own communities, like has been mentioned before, is that's where you need to draw upon, where are you and who's in your community, and build those relationships. And so we recruited Indigenous educators. And so we brought them in, and we gave them a task. We said, we want it to be infused with Indigenous teachings. And so we made the right fit with the staff and with the teachers that we brought in for the summer. And we asked them to do that. So like Tony was saying, we brought in our local community, and their network was very strong. And so we tapped into their networks, and they knocked it out of the park. I mean, it couldn't have been more successful. And we were so amazed at their network and the people that they knew. And so we had Indigenous authors, we had a literacy component, a STEM component, language and culture, and an art component. And so they, with their network and the community people that they knew, the Indigenous people, we had Indigenous authors, we had Indigenous artists, we had, we did all types of art. And so that was really something that really strengthened our network. And so now we're able to utilize, one of our goals was to utilize that network to continue throughout the school year to be able to draw upon those people that now we have relationships with.
Something that our program did for our summer camp last year, and thinking about bringing in your local tribes in that way. Sometimes when we take these standards, or we take these objectives, and we look for sources to do lessons, that there might be this narrative out there of like past or even some negative things associated with Indigenous people. There's always those negative statistics and whatnot, but if you're partnering with your tribes and your community, you're going to see all the good that's out there right now. Carrie touched on the language and culture revitalization efforts within our tribes, and now that they're, we're in a digital age, they're going digital and things. So if you're doing that, you're going to see all of those good things and in a contemporary light, what's actually happening. So we brought in the Pawnee Sea Preservation Project from the Pawnee Nation to talk about agriculture and give a hands-on lesson as well. And they were learning history at the same time, and they were learning about community. And I know that's one of the standards for elementary students is to learn about what a community is. And sometimes we think we can, Stillwater is a community, the Cowboys are a community, but really what Indigenous community is completely different. So you're getting a lot out of those resources for many, many lessons, and not just one subject.
I just want to add that as far as our tribal education department, that we are always available to present information. And I think some of our employees had kind of got, why do we have to do this? But I had explained to them that it's important because we don't present just to Native students, we present to non-Native students, everybody, at the schools. It's important, like we have all said, that they see us and we're telling them this information, that we are, we work, we're still alive, we're still very much thriving. We can speak our language, we can share our stories, we can sing our songs. It's important for them to see us that, like you said, modern day, present day, that we're still here, we still exist, we're still among you. Some of our schools didn't even know that, Concho, where our tribal headquarters are located, they didn't even know Concho was right up the road from them. But also that can just happen from a simple conversation, from just asking. And we tell them all the time, don't be afraid to ask, just ask. And, what do you want? We get a lot of requests for, of course, Native American Month, October. And then also now, because of the land run in April, we do get a lot of request for us to come to schools and present information. But, you know, it's important for us when we do present that we're telling from a Shine Arapaho perspective. We don't generalize, we tell whose land you are, whose land you're on, who we are. And then also important for people to know that Shine Arapaho is 2 different tribes, 2 different languages, 2 different cultures, 2 different ways of life. We may be similar in a number of ways, but 2 very different. And, you know, where we're from, you're either Cheyenne or Arapaho, people get very territorial about it. So it can get kind of ugly sometimes, but it's all good, all in good fun. But, you know, we have to be aware too that when we're sending people, we're sending a Cheyenne, we're sending Arapaho, so that we're telling both perspectives. So that's something unique about our tribe.
Great, thank you for sharing that. One kind of contemporary question, piggybacking off of this, how can lived cultural experiences be regarded as professional development for tribal members?
I'll start. I would say that there's no substitute for authentic experiences and cultural exchanges in our communities. So it's nice to watch a documentary or read a book, but there's really no exchange for the impact that it can make on a teacher to be in the community in which, you know, they serve Native students. As it's been said, no matter where you work in Oklahoma, chances are you're going to work near or on an Indigenous community somewhere. And so it's really important for those exchanges. Also, which kind of ties back to the connection to the history, is that sometimes, you know, if we don't make those connections between the history and how that affects us today, then by the time they reach my classroom in post-secondary school, they already have perceptions. They already have negative ideas about Native people because they've never been taught. They've never been taught about sovereignty. They don't know anything about the trust responsibility. They don't know anything about treaty rights. And so to them, to some students, it seems like it's unfair treatment or unequal advantages or benefits and things like that. So you really have to, it's really so important to make the ties between how the history affects today, because if they never learned the history, then they have all of these misconceptions by the time they reach young adulthood about the contemporary issues that we have and our status as dual citizens. So I just wanted to add that as well.
Can I add real quickly that I don't know if Tony was talking about non-Native students. However, this can also include Native students. So we've all attended public school system, probably more than likely here in Oklahoma. We weren't taught our history. We weren't taught about who we are. If you had it in the home, you were special. You were privileged, I would say, because that you were taught a number of things, those cultural lived experiences at home while you're growing up. And I was one of those people. I was pretty grateful that I had that in my life. However, when you're a public school system and you don't see yourself in the administrators, in the curriculum, or you're a mascot, it can have a negative effect on you and your identity. So, figuring out where your place is, where you belong in these public schools is sometimes hard for our Native students. You're lucky if you have a home that can reaffirm that for you. So I didn't know all those things. I didn't know what sovereignty meant. I didn't even know how to pronounce it. You know a little bit about Native history growing up. Okay, there's some things that happened and that weren't right. You hear from your family, but I didn't get introduced to all of these concepts until I went to a tribal college. So I was in public school system, went to a tribal college, and was being taught by Native professors and Native history. And I was just like thinking, why did I know these things? I should know these things. I'm Native. Why didn't I know, this reading about the Sand Creek Massacre? Why was I never taught those things? And also, why did I never seek those things out? So really being, hit in the face with all of these issues, and I chose to get my undergraduate degree in American Indian Studies. And at the time, this was like 20 years ago, and everybody's like, why are you doing that? What are you gonna do with that degree? And I'm like, I don't know, but I'm enjoying learning about, Indigenous people. And I'm able to write research papers about the Cheyenne Arapaho people and learn more, and that never connected for me till I was in college. I never made that connection. So, if you're not attending college and getting that, you do have to seek that out sometimes for yourself. So that also goes back to the student and what they want to know, understanding who they are. I know several adults now later in their life that they didn't have that in their home. So now they're, trying to learn those things and, taking part and learning along the way. And it's never too late, So that, I think that can negatively affect our Native students, because I was one of them. So it doesn't just affect non-Native students.
Yeah, and if they don't seek out those opportunities even in college, they'll never, where will the opportunity be if we don't address it sooner in their education? So yeah, it's a good point.
And I think that's great for teachers who are watching now, so that they can try to address this in their classrooms, and they can take that extra step to find those outside resources. I know, I've taught in the public school system, and I know how limited curriculum can be. And so if you, like, as Tony was saying, I try to improve upon my teaching practices. And so I was always seeking outside resources. And so whatever teachers that are listening now, this is, a great opportunity to go ahead and take that extra step so that you can teach social studies objectively. So you're not just teaching the one side of history, which, in history, there's always, we're learning from the winner's side, the winner's point of view. We don't often get to see, what's happening on the other side. So that's a great point. Thank you.
I also think if we're using lived experiences for professional development, then it makes connecting to the issues, the current issues and the historical issues a lot easier. A good example of that is yesterday was Orange T-shirt day. And that was in remembrance and bring awareness to our ancestors and relatives that didn't make it home from boarding schools, and the survivors that did. So if you're listening to lived experiences, sometimes, being taught in that historical sense, you're thinking, okay, those were great grandparents, or that was, turn of the century, whatnot. But, the reality is that one of the last boarding schools, we still have BIE, but were closed in the 90s. That wasn't that long ago. So if we're listening to those lived experiences, we're connecting those to real people and real things that happen and still affect us. I mean, the 90s were when I was in high school, and I'm a boarding school survivor, or not survivor, but my family went through boarding school. So if it's important to listen to those stories and to those people so that that they're real, that they're here in the present.
And I was thinking about this question. I think I was thinking about it a little bit differently. So maybe from the perspective of an administrator who is hiring for roles within Indian education or even outside of it, taking into account lived experience of Indigenous people and understanding that those may or may not be reflected in the standards or certifications that we are used to seeing in a Euro-Western context. So, for example, in our area where our tribe is located, there was an open position for a really long time for an Indian Ed director, and they were wanting somebody with at least a master's degree. And there are a lot of Indigenous folks that have a master's degree or above, but we knew from our tribal perspective that they had passed up a lot of good candidates who were really tied into our Native communities in our area, because they wouldn't even look at anybody who did not have a master's degree. So they were essentially denying the lived experience of the Indigenous people in our area who were educators, who very much were qualified to do the role, because they were only looking at certifications and degrees from a Western point of view. So when you're thinking about lived experiences, recognizing the biases of what counts as knowledge, and not even separating out Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous science versus scientific knowledge, it is all knowledge, and really recognizing those biases and respecting our elders who don't have what we would call a doctorate now, but have that much or more when you think about what they know about their tribe and culture.
And I think that we're still at a place that trying to get people to value those lived experiences, that it has value to it, and that we're still trying to assert those things, like Tasia said, that when we hire too, it's, well, what community are they from? What family are they from? You sometimes overlook like the degree requirements. Is that really necessary? Because they could do that while they're here working. But and also that goes for Native people too, that those lived experiences and what they know, what they've learned and that they've taught, that getting them to realize that that is valuable information. Some people don't know that, and they have to be reminded sometimes that it's important for us, especially working in Native communities, to be connected. So always being connected to your community, your people, your family, who your families are. That's just as important. And like Allison had said too, that just ask, if you do have a Title VI coordinator or a Native teacher. I mean, we all know each other in some way, one way or another. So it's like, hey, I know someone here, let me connect you with that person. So everyone on here I know, with the exception of one person, but we all can connect. And, that's how small Indian country is. But we could connect you to the right people. Just don't be afraid to ask.
Okay, I think that's a great reminder just for any of the teachers or administrators who are listening, and hoping to enrich their curriculums or their outreach or what they're bringing into the classroom, to reach out to your local tribe, or reach out to contemporary artists and creators who are, or scientists, to really enrich your history curriculums with contemporary Indigenous life. Next question: what are educators' roles in helping preserve Native culture and language? We've talked about this a little bit tonight, but some of the details of tribal history and tribal culture specific to each tribe. I guess what do you want educators to embrace about their role in helping preserve Native culture?
I would say that you can't teach Oklahoma history without teaching Indigenous history. You can't teach US history without teaching Indigenous history. So to attempt to stay away from difficult topics is to not teach comprehensively. And so I just feel like there's just really no way to do that. And I'll come back to this question too. I kind of got off track with that.
One thing that I think is really important that I think educators can do to help preserve Native culture is to recognize the diversity of Native nations and tribal people in respect to their identity. So educators will not always be able to recognize the Indigenous students in their classroom just by looking at them, because everybody looks very different, and may not be recognizable as what we think of as phenotypically Native American. So you may have students in your classroom who identify as Native American, and if the educator is not open to allowing the student to identify themselves and being allow them to be authentic in where they are with their tribal identity, that could push a lot of students away from learning more about their tribe and participating. It is a huge problem within my tribe, and I think within Indian country as a whole, of people not feeling Native enough. There are a lot of reasons for that, but if students are made to feel in the classroom that they are not Native enough, that can turn somebody off from participating in their culture and learning more. So just being aware of the breadth and the diversity of tribal identities among students and respecting where they are, I think can go a long way in helping those students feeling comfortable exploring their identity and learning more.
And to expand on Tasha's thoughts, and maybe to put a little bit more pressure on our educators, but in my school district, our students are not what you typically think a Native looks like or acts like or supposed to be, all those stereotypes. I do come from Frontier, and we were 65% Native American, and we were our students were connected to their culture and their community, and lived in those homes that were filled with culture and just surrounded in them. But in Stillwater, I have students that the school district, this curriculum that they're learning right now is probably one of the only times in their life they're going to be around or exposed to Native culture or their culture. So to put that in perspective, if they're a Cherokee tribal citizen and just have that membership, and they're learning Cherokee once every 2 or 3 years in a standard, that's probably going to be the only time that they learn that. And that's on my responsibility to make sure that the cultural activities are there. But just to put a little bit more pressure on our educators, you might be the only source. So I encourage you to get it right, to be accurate. And also I kind of have to swing back to something that Carrie brought up earlier. And if you're in a school district with a Native mascot, you need to actively work to end using that Native mascot, because how are you going to educate your students and and be accurate and incite critical thinking and citizenship if you have a Native mascot? And those are so harmful to our Native students.
So I'll answer that, the educator's role. I believe that begins with you, of who you are as an educator. I think that it also takes that if you're going to teach Indigenous history, that you also have to be critically reflective in yourself as an educator and reflect on your own biases, prejudice, stereotypes that you have of Indigenous people. I'm sure you have some because we're surrounded with them, like everyone has said. So really confronting, what do you think about Indigenous people, becoming, and the goal I think is to become critically conscious of settler colonial education and how that is in everyday teaching and curriculum. Everything that we're taught has that effect of settler colonialism. So you have to be critically reflective. The goal is to become critically conscious and say, okay, I understand that this is the perspective that we're being taught. However, I can expand and do my own research and provide supplemental information because I have Indigenous students in my classroom and I want them to feel welcome. I want them to feel seen, heard, valued. And I think really that's all that we're always asking, is just that mutual respect of, acknowledge who we are. We're different. We are unique in a number of ways, and you bring up sovereignty and all these things that are these big issues that we never are taught. So I think it's important for educators to understand that what makes Native American Indigenous people unique and different, because we are from any other race, and understanding that. But then I can recommend that there's a framework called Transformational Indigenous Praxis Model. And if you read it, there are different stages of become critically conscious, but it also involves being self-reflective, critically self-reflective of how you teach. Why do you teach this way? Is it just because that's the perspective that everyone's doing it just because, we're always going to just continue the standard, the norm. However, if you're really serious about that, you will do that work within yourself and then and then start teaching our students, because it does affect not just our Native students, but our non-Native students as well. So if anybody wants that information, I can email that to you.
Carrie, I think that would be something really helpful to publish with this online afterwards so that anybody can find it. So maybe we'll connect, and I'll make sure that that ends up with this call, because I mean, learning sovereignty, learning treaty rights, those are huge framework topics that everybody in the state lives within. That I think it's interesting that you have post-secondary students approaching those topics for the first time, having never, understood, especially with events happening now, like the McGirt decision, big jurisdictional questions that are going to affect everyone. I think it would be interesting to see a lesson on sovereignty for like a 6th grade class. Like I would love, if any of you have that resource, like I think we should share that, because yeah, so please feel free to send those, and we will touch on that. Well, we're wrapping up a little bit. We've got about 10 minutes left. So maybe, does anybody else want to take this opportunity to answer that kind of final question before we pivot into a talk on resources? Again, educators' roles in helping preserve Native culture and language.
Yeah, if I could have the opportunity, oh, sorry, just to tie up my thought and where I was going with that. I'll tell you about an experience that I had where a student said, I think they came from a place of resentment in a way, and said something to the effect of, my background is I'm Italian, and I don't expect the school to teach me about how to be an Italian. And so my response to that was, but you would if you were in Italy. We're not talking about a foreign culture or foreign people. We're talking about indigenous people to this land. And so it's not that we expect educators to teach our children how to be Native. We know how to do that. But it's just recognizing that Native history is intertwined. It's intertwined in Oklahoma history. It's intertwined in US history. So it's not that we're asking you to cater to our children or asking for some unfair advantage, but we're just asking to be included, and for those subjects to not be ignored or marginalized, because for a variety of reasons, but just to be included, because again, you can't teach it comprehensively if you're leaving or negating certain subjects. So I just wanted to kind of tie my initial thought together.
I'll just share a story to tie up my end of what I'm doing in my home. So I have a daughter, she's 8 years old, she's in the 3rd grade. And we, our house is filled with books, native books. I buy her books by Indigenous authors. She's always gifted books like that. So yesterday, like Allison had said, was wear your orange t-shirt day. She wore her shirt. But prior to this, we always have discussions, and I know she doesn't maybe always remember what assimilation, pronouncing that and what that means. However, I can give her examples and we read about it. And so we had talked about the boarding school experience, and I shared a story with her about her grandmother, her great grandmother, who she's named after, and her experience and the effect it had on our mother. And so I told her that and the significance of the day, and we had talked about it. So she said, okay, I'm going to take 3 of my books to school and see if my teacher can read them, and Darlington's just like any other school that, the curriculum that they have to learn every day. And so she said, I'm gonna take them to see if my teacher can read them. And I was like, okay, that sounds good. So yesterday they didn't get to them. However, today when I picked her up from school, she said, hey mom, my teacher read all of the books that I brought. They're all 3 native books, and she just said, and I got up and I introduced myself, because she can introduce herself in Arapaho. I introduced myself, I told them about my culture, and I told them about boarding school and what it did to my family, and then we read the books. And she said, and everybody cheered for me. So, I think that, she's fortunate, so I can teach her those things, and, she's learning all of these things in the home. And, like I said, not everyone gets to do those things at home. And, her class is, I think, majority Native American students. But, you know, to see these books, I don't know if they have them at home, but, you know, even the non-native students to say, oh, these are native books written by, and then, you know, native authors, and here's, you know, someone speaking. And I didn't tell her to do that. She just got up and did it, you know, so she was all excited. And but, you know, I think that's just important of, you know, what we're teaching our kids and our grandkids and what they're going to know and how they're going to challenge that curriculum, and you know, what they're taught are not taught about Native and are taught about themselves. So I just want to share that real quick. But yeah, that happened today, so she was pretty excited.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. Let's go into any kind of other final thoughts. Make sure all 5 of you have a chance to kind of contribute a final thought, and we can go a little bit over time. It looks like we're going to. So please, if you you know, kind of want to have a final statement, kind of as a reminder, speaking to educators about, you know, meaningfully teaching, you know, detailed Indigenous history, respectful Indigenous history in their classrooms.
I just want to say, I know we're going to talk, are we talking about resources now or just wrapping up our final thoughts?
Let's do both. Please,
Okay, I'll start.
If you have a great resource, share it, and then I'll make sure that those, please mention them, you know, kind of direct people, and then we'll link, we'll have something very easy for listeners to use as well. Go ahead.
Okay, so like I said before, I'm tribal childcare, and so something that like Carrie had talked about her child, you know, my daughter, she's 23, she turned 23 the other day, and I look at her and I'm like, who is this young lady? You know, how did she get to be the way she is? And it's amazing to me because I am definitely the oldest person on this panel. And when I grew up, you know, I was in elementary school in the 70s, you know, and so that was a long time ago. And so growing up in Southwest Oklahoma in a rural town, and I look at my daughter and it's so amazing. And that's what we're trying to accomplish. You know, that's what we're trying to accomplish with early childhood and with Indigenous education and teaching and respecting and valuing our culture and our languages, because, you know, God created us who we are, you know, and we just want that to be respected and valued. And so when I look at her, it cracks me up because the things that come out of her mouth is she goes to the University of Oklahoma. Right now, during the pandemic, she's been down here at Cameron, but she cracks me up and I'm just going like, well, I guess we did a good job, you know, and I'm very proud of her. But I'm a member of IPAG, the Indigenous Peoples Action Group, and the resource that I'm going to share is called Indigenous Early Care and Education, Understandings and Perspectives, and I'll put a link on it. The Rural Forum Foundation is a nonprofit. It's a global network. It's the best network that I'm a part of. And I work with Indigenous peoples across the globe, and we meet once a month on Zoom, like we're meeting here. And you know, it's inspiring. It's so inspiring to meet. And I, even if I'm dead tired, I have to get on that meeting with my colleagues from around the world, because it's, you know, Indigenous people are, you know, our values and our teachings are very similar, even though we're all unique in our own tribes and nations. But I'm going to share that with you, and the link that it has, I'm actually using the document right now. It's only a 16-page document, and we wrote it collaboratively. And even though we're early childhood group, Indigenous group, it is beneficial to everyone. And I would just encourage everyone to take a look at it. The link that I'm going to provide is on the World Forum Foundation page, and it has a cafe, like where we actually did a webinar, a panel like we're on right now. And there's a recording of it where we're talking about these principles, but it's a it's really, we wanted it to be a springboard for any educator, especially an early childhood educator, to use in their own classrooms, whether they have Indigenous children in their classroom or not. And so everything that everyone said on this panel is probably in this document. And so it's really cool. It starts out with generational trauma. It has curriculum, pedagogy, language and culture. It has all these things, and it's not, we're working on a teaching guide right now, and we're hoping to have that done. It probably won't be done by the spring, but we're going to be presenting it in the spring at our World Conference. But I'm going to share that, and I just would encourage you guys to click on that link, and it'll be helpful. And I am actually using the document right now to make a model classroom for my program. But thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn.
So I will make sure to share these resources, but certainly happy to share anything that the Citizen Potawatomi Nation is working on. I think that would be the takeaway that I would like to highlight, is wherever you're located within the state of Oklahoma, or really wherever you're located throughout this continent, you should be connecting with the tribal nations and the Indigenous people in your area. So I welcome anybody to reach out to the Citizen Potawatomi Nation to find out what services we have and what curriculum and lesson plan resources we have. But also, Allison might talk more about the Oklahoma Council for Indian Education. She is the president of OC. We do have the Oklahoma Council for Indian Education, which posts resources on our social media a lot, have advocates in each of our quadrants, as well as the National Indian Education Association, which has a ton of great resources on their website. Both OC and NIEA have conferences and conventions, just like the History Education Council. So that's a really great way as an educator, even when you're not native, both of those conferences welcome non-natives to come and learn how to teach Indigenous education and Indigenous students well. So those are some really great resources, and I'll make sure to share those links. Much.
Tasia, thank you.
And to kind of piggyback off of the Oklahoma Council for Indian Education, right now our website's being fixed, so we don't have our representatives on our board. But if you contact myself or Tasia is the president-elect, we can get you hooked up with your quadrant. We have a Northwest, Northeast, Southwest, Southeast quadrant, and members at large that can connect you to resources in your area as well. And we invite you out to our conference. It's coming up in December. We do have our past conference from last year posted on our website as well. So it was a virtual conference, so you can download that and listen to it. I would also like for our teachers here to know that that are listening, that we have the largest Native student population in the United States. We have 39 federally recognized tribes. I think that's important for our teachers to know that. We also receive the largest amount of funding for Title VI, and we have the most programs in Oklahoma as well. But I guess I would just say utilize your Title VI programs or your JOM programs to be liaisons for you, or collaborate with them to do your lessons, and support them in the way they can. Just to kind of put this out there, sometimes we're the only natives that work in our district, or one of a very small group in the district. So sometimes we're kind of on an island. So support would be nice. But another thing is that I think, just to piggyback off of Carrie's idea earlier about self-reflecting and critically thinking about yourself, is explore our contemporary culture right now. I mean, we could do that every day through social media. I mean, you can go follow somebody on TikTok, Indigenous person, so you can get that perspective of us now. And then I have to plug First Americans Museum that just opened in Oklahoma City, and it is so awesome. I encourage you all to check that out as well. Thank you.
It's amazing. Thank you, Allison.
Carolyn, I just want to say thank you for sharing that about your daughter. And I had told my daughter, I was like, you are way better than I ever was at 3rd grade, being 8 years old, being able to say that. But I didn't get to introduce myself, so I do want to introduce myself real quickly before we end. But I just want to say Doze, Carrie Whitlow, Naasi Hana, Naka E Hisse, Hanana E Nihi, Hanana E Nana, Na Hitasina Na, Hini Na Atina, Hawa Awu, Ne Bahat, Violet Franklin, Nebesti Bahat, Virgil Franklin, Ne Na, Dara Franklin, Ne Sana, Billy Whitlow, Nathanat, Violet Romanos, Hana Ye Na Habetana, Na Haho Hafana. And I just said, my name is Carrie Whitlow. My Arapaho name is Light or Yellow Hair Woman. I'm Arapaho and I'm Cheyenne. I'm from El Reno, Oklahoma. My grandparents are Virgil and Violet Franklin. My parents are Dara Franklin and the late Billy Whitlow. My daughter is Violet. I said I'm blessed to see you all, even though it's virtually. And thank you everyone for this time. I just want to say that tribes and tribal education departments are always looking for collaboration. So don't hesitate to reach out to us and, ask us to collaborate on, if you're having Native American Month or something, you want to bring presenters in. And also I do want to highlight Title VI. So like Allison had said, if you do receive Title VI funding, use that for your Indigenous and Native students and hire a coordinator. It is very helpful and very helpful for creating those partnerships with tribes and TEDs and TEAs. So thank you. That's all I want to say.
Carrie, thank you very much.
So for my closing, I think I want to tell a story about my daughter as well. So I have two, Jaylee and Lily, and they're so different. They're 2.5 years apart, but they're so different. And I'll just share a story about my oldest daughter. So Jaylee, I think she was probably in first grade, and we are a powwow family, so we travel to powwows all over the country. And so there are some that are just a part of our family traditions that we attend those annually. And so sometimes that conflicts with our school schedule. And so we just, my daughters just know that we're gonna probably miss some days of school when it comes time for that celebration or that gathering. And so we went out of town for a celebration. And when we came back, I guess some of her classmates were asking about where she was. And so she said, well, we went to a powwow. And they said, well, what were you doing at a powwow? And she was telling them about her dance style and about the foods that she ate and things like that. And they really didn't understand. And she said that they thought that some of the things that she said was kind of weird. So I got, a little concerned about that, thinking she was in this situation where her classmates were judging her, and how did she handle that, and worried about her feelings and things like that. And she said, but Mom, they don't understand everything. Everybody can't be Kiowa. And I thought that was just so great that she came back with that. Like, it's not my problem that you think that, our cultural practices or whatever is, you don't understand them, or you think they're weird, or whatever the case may be. But she totally was fine with it. She handled it with grace. And so I just wanted to share that story about Jaylee, because, everybody was sharing stories about their kids. And yes, you're right. It's just amazing. They're so much better. They're just better versions, I think, of anything that we could ever be. So we're very proud of our girls. In terms of resources, I was also going to mention the First Americans Museum, but also the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian has a lot of online exhibits that change, that they have a lot of exhibits that rotate. So there's always different new content that you can find through the National Museum of the American Indian. Also, it may not be necessarily reaching out to a person in terms of resources in local tribes. You can find information about tribal museums that may also have free resources for you, or cultural centers that tribes may house, and language programs. So I'll just put in a little plug. For example, I work with our Kiowa language department, and our Kiowa language, within that department, we have a Kiowa language culture and language revitalization program. So we're a teacher preparation program. And so we are always putting out free printable worksheets, things that are seasonal, things that may fall in line with the curriculum that you already have. And so I encourage you to visit social media and all these other outlets, and just do a search near the tribal headquarters that you may be located around. And you may find, just searching the tribal name, you're probably going to find a lot of resources online. I was also going to mention the TikTok app as a resource, because we have many of the most quality resources out there are being made by our young people. And so we have a lot of young people that are educating their peers, educating their teachers with these TikTok videos that they're making. Everybody has a phone, everybody has a smartphone or an iPhone, and they're really making quality multimedia resources that are available and free for everyone. So I just wanted to also mention that, because there's a lot of good content out there, that watching one of those comedy skits or something can break through all kind of stereotypes with just watching one. So I feel like those have value as well. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Augusta, for this opportunity to talk.
I'll go ahead and wrap up on my part. A lot of the resources that I was going to mention have already been mentioned, but another resource that teachers could seek out is even using apps on your phone, or if your students have access to iPads. One resource that you could use is called Whose Land. This identifies tribal jurisdictions. Like we said before, you could tie that into your curriculum. And also Native Times is another app that you can seek out. And then I have to add a story about my daughter, since everyone else did. My daughter, she's 2, and her name is Aswamokwa, and her English name is Liliana. And one breakthrough that we're trying to make on our end as parents, and addressing, historical trauma and not being fluent language speakers, one way that we're trying to break through is teach our daughter. And so we're from the Sac and Fox tribe, and because of the resources that our tribe has through our language department, they have an app where you have a dictionary that you can access for numbers, letters, animals, things like that. What we can't learn from her papa, he's a fluent speaker, we learn through our app. And so my daughter right now, she's 2, and she can count to 3 in Sac and Fox language. So we're trying to break those historical trauma what's the word I'm looking for, boundaries or things that are holding us back as Native people. But I just wanted to thank you again, Augusta, for giving us this platform so that we can meet and we can address educators not only across the state, but maybe those who are also watching nationwide. And I just want to thank all of the panelists for your input, your insight. I really appreciate it, and you guys did an amazing job.
Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, Amanda, and thank you for coordinating this, Amanda, and getting everybody on board, finding these great voices that I think are just a very rich, special gift to the education community in Oklahoma and nationwide, anybody who's listening. So yes, thank you to the Oklahoma Council for History Education. So ladies, let's just make sure if you have any more resources that you want published with this. There's a lot of great, books and apps mentioned. You can drop those in the chat and I'll make sure that they get published online. So for anybody who's listening, this information is going to be published on the News 9 and News on 6 digital sites. This call is recorded and it will be published as well. Feel free to use it as a resource. Yes, and any final thoughts, ladies? I just appreciate all of you so much. Okay.
Amanda has to take us to dinner sometime.
I think that's fair.
Definitely.
Okay, wonderful. It takes a couple of minutes for the live to come down, so I will just say good night to all of you. Have a great rest of your weekend, and just as a reminder to everybody, the Council for History Education has a virtual conference all weekend. You can look them up on social or their website, and we will link to that as well in this article on our apps and our websites. So there's more information coming this weekend for educators. Definitely take advantage of that. And again, thank you all. Have a great rest of your night.